Good afternoon. This is Point Blank. I am Thomas Raphael.
And I'm Raneem and Thomas.
Today we're going to talk about the international situation with the state of Palestine and youth unemployment in the UK, which today hit 1 million people. Firstly, youth unemployment. The situation is as follows. In the last 24 hours, youth unemployment hit over 1 million people. However, the figure is more like around 800,000 if full-time and part-time students are not counted. So the situation is not nearly as bad as first thought. However, at the same time, inflation, the measure of rising prices, is over 5%. And Mervyn King has downgraded the growth forecast of the United Kingdom. This means that more people cannot get a job, and without a job, it's harder to pay for the necessities. But there's reason for hope. The Bank of England expects inflation to fall to 2% in 2012. The news which says that inflation is so high doesn't tell the whole story. Food prices in supermarkets have gone down. Overall shopping prices have gone down. And the end of the war in Libya has helped slightly lower petrol prices. But youth unemployment is still a huge problem for the country overall. Many young people say that they have applied for dozens of jobs without even a reply. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. Other countries have a very different problem. Singapore's growth rate is a staggering 18%, despite the global downturn. And unemployment there is at a historic low of 1.9%. What is their secret? That's what we shall discuss.
Why do you think there is such a high level of unemployment among the youth?
This is a serious problem for us all. Mervyn King feels we're about to head into a second credit crunch, which is worrying considering Northern Rock has just been sold off to Virgin Money.
It's even more worrying because we still haven't recovered from the first one, Thomas.
Oh, absolutely. But if you add on a second credit crunch to the first, we're going to have higher rates of youth unemployment than we've ever had in the past.
Tell me what you think of that. The number of women out of work increased by 43,000 to reach 1.09 million, the highest rate since February 1988. What does that mean to the women in the UK? Are we just going backwards?
Well, it's not merely a question of women. Men have lost their jobs as well. I think to say that this is a problem only for women or that only women should be looked at would be wrong. However, obviously from a perspective of those who have lost their jobs, it is very difficult, especially because jobs among women are normally part-time, temporary jobs, or at least the rate is much higher among women than among men. And therefore, the job market for women is much less stable, and their future financial viability is much lower than it otherwise would be. This is obviously a huge problem.
Economically, they are not really present because most women who do not work are not paid for their caregiving. So unpaid work is still work, but it's not appreciated.
So when you say caregiving, you're talking about looking after their children, or for other people's children?
Their children.
Their own children. So in other words, being a housewife isn't a job as such that gets paid. Is that? Well, I mean, clearly that is the case, and single mothers are the most likely group of people to end up in poverty, and that is a serious problem.
With the growing rate of poverty, there grows the amount of benefits that are claimed from the state.
Absolutely, and it's the same reason why, although the government wants to reduce the deficit and have for that reason been making government cuts, the amount of money they're having to spend on benefits is going up because the number of unemployed is going up at the same time. And you could see that also in the Thatcher government in the 1980s. unemployment rocketed in the 1980s.
Yes.
And that meant that although there were huge government cuts, the actual amount of spending that the government did rose in both absolute and real terms. So it's a huge problem.
Thomas, I finally ask you, what do you think is the secret behind Singapore's, I'd say, opposite situation?
Well, Singapore, it's all about, the unemployment line is all about supply and demand. And in this case, we can't decrease the number of workers. We have the number of people we have in our society. We can't decrease that. So the only way of decreasing unemployment is to increase the number of employers. We have to incentivize employers to our shores. So, how does Singapore so successfully attract employers? Or what is the difference between Singapore and the United Kingdom? Well, there are a few facts here. The Singaporean government only has an income tax rate, the highest of which is 20%. It's progressive, so the least wealthy in society pay 0%, and the most pay 20%. But in the United Kingdom, that rate is 50%. And the UK is losing employers and tax revenue from this 50p tax rate. 53 million alone was lost from London city workers moving to Switzerland. Just one other country, £53 million was lost. How can we reduce unemployment if we are encouraging employers to move abroad? This is the problem.
Thank you, Thomas. Moving on to our international topic. As we all know, last month Palestine was recognized as a full member of the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. With existing 194 member states, 107 voted yes to Palestine, 14 voted no, and 52 abstained. Among the member states who said no were Israel, US, Canada, and Sweden. The UK, on the other hand, abstained. Immediately after Palestine was accepted in the UNESCO, the United States made major cuts in the UNESCO funding, 20% less than any other. We cannot ignore the fact that the US and Israel are allies. Following that, the Director General of the UNESCO, Lena Bokova, released a statement in response to the US's funding cuts. In her statement, she said that the US should be more interested in world stability at this time, and the US has always been a core partner of the UNESCO, and with less funding from the US, the UNESCO is less likely to be more effective in spreading freedom in areas like Iraq, Tunisia, and Egypt, especially in the realm of reporting. The US was also a member in the UNESCO's initiatives in Afghanistan that taught officers how to read and write. The US was also part of initiatives that fought extremism. Thomas, what do you think of that?
Well, either that suggests that UNESCO is willing to capitulate, and if they go hand in hand with the United States policies, then clearly Palestine would not be included in UNESCO or recognised by it. However, I don't think that's going to happen. I think perhaps it was inevitable that the United States would reduce the funding of UNESCO if UNESCO accepted that Palestine was a state. But that gives us what is the role of UNESCO, of the United Nations Education Committee.
Thomas, with the UNESCO being the only UN body with a mandate of promoting the Holocaust's remembrance, shouldn't it also have the opportunity to go on the other side and actually support Palestinians in their issues in poverty, human rights inequalities, and spreading, for example, education in the region right now?
Well, one always has to remember it's all very well, things in the world should happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will happen. So the question is, should the role of UNESCO be political? Or should it be about protecting World Heritage Sites? About helping, educating people around the world? And therefore, perhaps, with this loss of funding from the US, which was inevitable and is the right of the US to withdraw, considering it is their money, was it right of them, on behalf of those people who they help, to recognise Palestine? What do you
Thomas,
think?
from their name, they're the UNESCO. They're concerned with education, with science, with culture. I mean, there's a very thin line between being concerned with the individual and leaning towards biopolitics. So this is the thin line.
What, biopolitics?
Yes, the type of politics that focuses on the individual.
Right, okay.
So one should be really wary of that really thin line, because the UN tends to have some political tendencies at this point, but with Palestine joining, it is a very sensitive situation, because having Palestine and Israel both hand in hand in the same committee as member states, that would form a lot of animosity and it will revive a lot of existing disputes. What really surprised me is that there has been previous coexistence between Arabs and Israelis in certain initiatives. For example, there have been initiatives set up in Jordan of world-class scientific research that was conducted by world-class researchers from Israel, Jordan, Egypt, alongside each other. So such coexistence actually has some promise for the functioning of the UNESCO in the future. So where's the gap here? Is it the animosity between Israel and Palestine, or is it probably just the value-laden idea that Israel and Palestine cannot coexist on the same committee or in the same organization? Because coexistence with the Arab and the Israelis has been proven in previous initiatives.
Well, clearly, cooperation is possible, and it should be possible. And what's more, is downright immoral of the Israelis and the Palestinians not to have come to an agreement over the last 50 years. But you said something very interesting, which was something which I at least have not thought about before. You described it as the relationship between the Israelis and the Arabs. Now, I always presumed this was a problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not the Israelis and the entire Arab world. Would you say that this is actually a much bigger problem than that?
I would definitely say so, because among the Arab countries exists some sort of Arab nationalism with its loyalty to Palestine and the Palestinians. So this is the sad truth. Even though countries have signed peace treaties with Israel, our support as Arab countries' support remain with the Palestinians, and Arab countries' hearts are with the Palestinians.
Right, but you seem to suggest that this means that it's harder for Arabs as a total, whether they are Iraqi Arabs or Syrian Arabs or Libyan Arabs, it's harder for them to cooperate with Jews. Is that right?
There's a huge difference between Jews and Israelis.
Absolutely.
Yes, but if you were saying Jews, Arabs embrace all religions and they don't have problems with other religions.
Okay.
But Arabs themselves have different religions. There are some Arab Jews.
Right, yeah, no, okay,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But as for Israelis, I think it would be a bit of a challenge to enhance coexistence and cooperation. It has been proven in the past that it can happen, which gives us promise for the future. But I think at least a minimum amount of animosity still lies between Arabs and Israelis.
So overall then, Do you feel that whose fault is it that UNESCO has lost finance? Is it the United States or is it UNESCO?
I think the fault was the lack of dialogue between the US and the UNESCO. What do you think?
Well, personally, I believe it's absolutely. I mean, a lack of dialogue, but also slightly inevitable. This was, after all, a kind of elected representative process of the world stage. 107 nations voted for. That says something quite significant, and therefore it cannot be ignored just by the United States. However, the United States has a right to withdraw funding if the goals of the organisation it is funding is not the same as its own. That's why they are a democratically elected American government. So there's two sides to that story. Who do you think is right about the recognition of the state of Palestine?
I think the recognition of the state of Palestine was the right thing to do at the time, because they have deserved and earned their voice over the years. The withdrawal of funding, as you said, was up to them because they are a democratic state. But I think there should be a reconsideration of the UNESCO's goals, the UNESCO's updated goals after Palestine has joined, and the US's existing goals for UNESCO, and then some kind of dialogue that enhances such parallel goals to actually remain parallel, I would say, and actually the issue of funding should be resolved. It is a dilemma and we cannot neglect it, but at this time I think we should be looking for solutions to such issues rather than dwelling on them.
Absolutely. This was Point Blank. I am Thomas Raphael.
And I am Raneem and Thomas. Thank you for watching, and keep posted for more episodes.